just a few images to stop you having to stare at me for the coming minutes. But this is the first time I've done something like this. I've hosted it before. I think some of you were there for Hannah Kleur doing her excellent stuff on the Reformation. And so I'm going to do something called Moscow the Third Rome. I think, let me just check one more time with participants. And there's no one else to come in, so I'm going to begin. So I'm going to begin with a wonderful piece of propaganda, which you'll see on your screen in front of you there. This was a tweet originally that was put up last February by the American Embassy. And if you look at it closely, you'll see it has a series of dates along the top with Kyiv underneath it. And then in a line below that, it has a series of pictures of Moscow. And it's pure propaganda. It's basically saying in these set times, 996, there's Desiatiana Church. Underneath in Moscow, there was simply just a field. So it really is having a kind of real pop at Vladimir Putin and his view of Russia and Greater Russia. But so it's not entirely unbalanced propaganda. I've put next to it a quotation from the same Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin to balance it off. Sorry, there's a few more people just coming in.
That's the full screen size. Yes, yes. Yeah. Oh, you're going to do.
So for those who've just entered, I've literally just begun talking about Moscow as the third Rome, and I've begun with this piece of propaganda which was put out by the American Embassy against Russia at the outbreak of the war last year. And I put next to it a quotation which hopefully you'll be able to see if I move this out of the way, which is a quotation from Vladimir Putin from his essay on Russia, which we'll look at again at the very final talk that we do. But it's a really good place to begin, because in many ways, the tweet pictures and the quotation from Vladimir Putin do an excellent job of summarizing what we're talking about in these talks. Here you have America mocking Russia for not existing before Kyiv. But it also reminds us that what we are seeing on our news cycle daily, hourly, and particularly today, we've seen a lot of terrible scenes from Ukraine, has its roots very deep set in Slavic Christian history and in the history of Kievan Rus, which we'll talk a bit about. Secondly, and more pertinent, it reminds us that the myth of Russian Christianity, the concept of Moscow as the third Rome, begins in Kievan Rus. It begins in the very place that we see on our news so often. That's one of the foundation origins of Russian Orthodoxy, the Russian Church, and the myth of Moscow as the third Rome. But before we set off on that journey, I want just to give some idea of where I hope these sessions might go. I've deliberately rooted the talks in the concept of Moscow as the third Rome, and I've chosen subjects that I hope give some idea of the power and pertinence of that idea, the roots and origins of the idea, and the way in which it has inflamed and enchanted minds over the centuries. A few disclaimers, though, which anyone will do when they do a talk like this. I'm not an historian, and I'm not attempting to offer a detailed and reflective history of Russian Orthodoxy. Many others would do that far better, although it should be said there aren't that many histories of Russian Orthodoxy. Instead, I'm hoping to lead you somewhere closer to where I was myself enchanted by some of the aspects of Russian Christianity and Russian Orthodoxy. My own interest was piqued less by the history and more by the way in which the faith has been handed down in idealistic terms, in some of the thinkers and in some of the theology and the philosophy and the movements that have emerged as that history has developed. The earliest roots of Christianity in the Slav world are traced back most often to the 9th century and to the missions of Kirill and Methodius, known as the Apostles to the Slavs. They were brothers from Byzantine Thessaloniki, and they were missionaries, and they were sent to the Arab Caliphate. They were both extremely gifted at languages, and they were sent to the Arab Caliphate and then to the Kingdom of the Khazars in 860. They're probably perhaps best known now for being those who originated the Cyrillic alphabet, which is properly known as the Glagolithic alphabet. But it was his disciples, Cyril's disciples, who named the alphabet after him. And that's often what we see now as the roots of a lot of Slavic language and writing. In the year 862, Rostislav, sometimes also called Rastislav, the Grand Prince of Moravia, requested Kirill and Methodius come on a mission to his people, the West Slavic area in Central Europe that would now include the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, Germany, Poland, Romania, Croatia, Serbia, and Ukraine. And Glagolithic became the lingua franca, if that's not a rather unpleasant sort of mixing of metaphors. And that's really where the Slavonic liturgy took root. And you'll probably know that old Church Slavonic is different to modern Slavonic. And that's not just because of age and tradition. It's because the way in which the brothers brought the language through has some of the origins in Byzantine Thessaloniki in the language there. So it is slightly different actually from Slavonic. It's not just that language has developed differently over the centuries. So they were the initial seeds of the Slavonic Christian world, but it was more like seed sowing than a whole-scale conversion. The story of the conversion of Holy Rus is a much slower and more piecemeal process, as we will see. And so this week I want to begin the talks by exploring the roots of Christianity as it came via Kievan Rus. So that area around Kiev, it's not a precise area. It's a as things weren't so bordered as they are nowadays. But Kievan Rus, believe it or not, gave the rise to the myth of Moscow as the Third Rome. And it is that conversion narrative that we'll explore a little bit this evening. It was the decline of Kievan Rus that we shall see that led to Moscow's rise, and we'll end with Moscow and how that very small and in many ways indistinctive place became a much more distinctive kingdom and an identity almost in its own right, and still persists today. Really, what we see quite often from Vladimir Putin in the way in which he often defines himself as a modern Tsar is sort of a neoconservative revival of the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome. So what we'll do is we'll trace briefly the declines and fortunes of the Russian Church, and it'll remind us of how inextricable the Russian nation-state story and the Russian Christian Church's story is. And as we'll see, we'll move together throughout the whole process of these talks. You'll see that all the way along, the identity of the nation, the identity of Russia, and its Christian roots are all tied together, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. In the next talk, we'll look at the 19th century, and we'll look at the way in which there was a move almost similar to a sort of romantic move in this country to what they call Slavophilism or Slavophilism, the love of all things Slavonic. But we'll also see how that then jars with the Westernization in Russia. And again, you'll see all the way along in these talks, another theme alongside Holy Rus is the idea of Moscow and of Russia being in between the West and in between the East, sometimes choosing very deliberately to go one way, at other times pulled between the two. It's one of the themes that will keep coming out. In the third talk, I want to look at a number of thinkers who hold the tension of those Western and Eastern approaches within the Christian tradition. They're also, I'll be absolutely honest, people and thinkers that I think you'd be interested to hear about and embody some of that Russian Christian mythology, as well as some very fine philosophy and theology. Finally, we'll come nearer to our own time, and we will look at Russian Orthodoxy as it is today. And you'll probably see a lot about Russian Orthodoxy in the papers lately. Most of it is pretty negative. And I want to look at some of that, but I also want to look at some of the more positive aspects that have been recorded by scholars in the last 10 or so years. And there is a positive story to tell alongside the negative stories. But of course, at the moment, it's the negative stories that win. So we'll look this week at the origins of Moscow's the Third Rome, next week at Westernization versus Slavophilism. Then we'll look at some of the key thinkers towards the end of the 19th century and 20th century. And then in the final one, we'll look at modern Russian Orthodoxy and how the Third Rome has come back for good and for ill. But if we go back to tracing the beginnings of Christian Russia, we've already looked at Kirill and Methodius, but the history of Russia itself in many ways begins in Scandinavia with the Vikings. In the East, they were not known as such, but in Russia, they became known as the Rus or the Rus, which is where the origins of the name Russia comes from. And while their name differed in this part in Russian, as opposed to being known as Vikings or raiders elsewhere, they were known absolutely as the Rus or the Rus. They probably traveled from Sweden as far as the accounts tell us, and they made a settlement high upon a hill in a place which bore the name Gorodisha. Nowadays, it's known as Novgorod, which of course is Russian for new city. As one scholar puts it, they were part of a single Scandinavian movement of restlessness, plunder, and settlement. And they plundered westwards and eastwards. And they, of course, would eventually attack Constantinople itself. And it was Patriarch Photius who described them as a wild and savage tribe from the north. Sounds a bit like the Northumbrians might possibly have been described in Mercia, that kind of sense of pillage from the north, or pillage in this case from the west. Patriarch Photius attempted to Christianize the Norse invaders with little success. It had worked well elsewhere, but the invasion and the invaders' empire grew. And eventually it reached as far south as the Dnieper River, which again you'll hear often in the battles over Donetsk and that region in Ukraine. And they used Kiev as a strategic center to continue their invasions and their plunder elsewhere. And the Norse invasion force began to settle. And as they began to settle, they became known as Rurikids. And they were named after Prince Rurik, who had settled in this place, Gorodisha, now Novgorod. As they settled, they began, as all settlers do, to begin to develop trade routes and alliances, not least with Byzantium. And here we can begin to see where those roots begin in Eastern Christianity, but also with that link to Byzantium. At the same time, the settlers began to lose their Norse identity, and they took on Slavic names. And mercenaries from the Rus were recruited as fine warriors for Byzantine armies. So through these alliances, military and trade, the relationships began to grow, and Christianity began to seep into little aspects of that culture of the invaders. And so in the 9th century, we begin to see the emergence of what becomes known as Kievan Rus or Kievan Rus. And there's evidence that early in the 9th century, there was even a small Christian presence in Kiev, a developed Christian presence of such. But it was probably as Olga's journey in 957 to Constantinople that really began to make a definite mark for Christianity, albeit a small one. Olga was the regent to her son, Prince Sviatoslav, who was the prince of the Rus. She wanted fully to embrace the Christian faith, and she did so, taking on the ostentatious name of Helena, a conscious allusion to the mother of Emperor Constantine, no doubt. But it was quite clear she was not just becoming Christian for her own good, but for developing some sense of her own power. And she attempted in the process to play off Latin Christendom and Byzantium. Should she go east or should she go west? That theme already really early on in the development of Moscow as the Third Rome. In her own terms, trying to work out which would provide the best alliance, which, if she was going to Christianize Rus, would give her the best power base. But in the end, even her own son, Sviatoslav, did not take up the faith. Her choice in the end of Byzantium, though, would turn Rus and later Russia to begin following the Eastern path, or it certainly laid early foundations for looking towards the East as a Christian possibility. Olga's attempts, though, in the end, culturally to convert Kievan Rus, as we've heard, not even via her son, were very successful. He refused conversion, and in the process, he prevented Christianity being established at the heart of the kingdom after her. But Sviatoslav's death made way for his son, Prince Vladimir, or sometimes known in Ukrainian as Vladimir. His part in the Christianization of the Slavic world is undeniable, but it's as undeniable as it is complex. It's mythologized, so it makes sense for us to explore that myth in a little bit greater depth. As with many nations with a long Christian heritage, the narrative around the beginnings of that heritage can become romanticized and mythological. We might think of stories around the Emperor Constantine and the early church, or we might think more locally of the ecclesiastical history by Venerable Bede of the English nation. The account that tells of Vladimir's conversion is known as the Nestorian Chronicle, or the narrative of bygone years, written down by a monk called Nestor. One scholar describes it as a moving tale of religious spontaneity, whilst another goes on to describe it as rather more prosaic. But the fact that the history is built upon myth itself reminds us that there is a profoundly powerful myth creation at the heart of the origins of Russian Christianity. Vladimir's myth is one of the most fascinating. As the scholar Will van der Berken wrote in his exploration of the founding texts of Kievan Rus, a rather good little book that's called Holy Russia and Christian Europe, he goes through all the texts that found Russia, looking at the myths behind them, and there are more than one. But van der Berken wrote in his exploration of this founding text that there is a sense in which Prince Vladimir was able, almost as a shopper confronted with a selection of fine goods, to choose the religion that most suited his needs, that would most develop his power base, and that would most suit his nation. It was almost like a multiple choice question for Vladimir. The Chronicle romantically puts it such that Vladimir goes out and encounters the Khazar Jews and Bulgars before rejecting all Islam and Judaism in favor of Christianity, and Christianity of a particularly Byzantine hue. Not without, we're told, considering its Latin alternative. The tale is told again in another text called The Life of Cyril. But the turn towards Byzantium, we are told in these hagiographical texts, came after the encounter with the Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The texts tell us that he was utterly overwhelmed by the encounter with such beauty, such that, quote, we did not know whether we were in heaven or earth. Vladimir is subsequently baptized in the river at Kherson. Again, you'll hear that quite often in the news, very sadly. And that sense of Vladimir being the Christianizer of Holy Rus, of Kievan Rus, is born. At the same time as the chronicler was detailing Vladimir's browsing through the aisles of the metaphorical faith boutique, the Emperor of Constantinople, Basil II, was in trouble. He was facing rivals for his throne. And, surprise, surprise, he sought military support again from Kievan Rus, known for their quality of warriors. And so Vladimir was keen to negotiate, and he negotiated hard. The Prince of Kiev, Vladimir, would offer troops, but with the proviso that he would be able to marry the emperor's sister, wonderfully named Anna Porphyrogenita. Basil was pretty reluctant to do this, because it would be an act that would not help her status nor his own. At the same time, he was pretty desperate, so it was agreed. And Kievan Rus, from that moment, essentially becomes a Christian nation. So it's not just Vladimir being baptized in the river Kherson. It is, in fact, the fact that he needs to provide a military alliance with Byzantium. So he does. He provides him with troops who are known as the Varangian Guard. We believe it was some 6,000 or so pretty elite troops. And they secured Basil's reign. So he got himself a wife, he got himself respectability in Byzantium, and Basil survived. For following his marriage to the Byzantine dynasty, he secured himself a place not only as a Christian nation, but within Christendom as it still existed. And following that, he ordered his people to convert to Christianity through baptism. The texts tell us this was all very peaceful and beautifully done, and everyone agreed to be baptized in the Dnieper River. Whether that was in fact the case, perhaps was less likely to be the case. But that's probably the first moment that we might begin to call Kievan Rus Christian in an established sense of a developed faith. Although it was clear that whilst Kiev was delighted, perhaps even captivated by Byzantium, Byzantium did not reciprocate. It was clearly the case that Kievan Rus was still seen as quite barbaric and backward compared to Byzantium. But to celebrate his place within Christendom, Vladimir soon set out to develop huge churches and cathedrals, and soon afterwards, in 1015, we begin to get the martyrology of two brothers, Boris and Gleb, the first two saints of Russian Orthodoxy, or Orthodox Christianity in Holy Rus. They were two young princes killed because they were said rather to die than to shed blood as Christians. Although, as scholars will tell you, the story is slightly tainted when one realizes it was in fact their older brother who killed them, a prince. Other more regular saints would follow. Theodosius, a man of aesthetic heritage, who chose to become a serf in the name of Christ despite his wealthy inheritance. Later on, becoming an abbot, he built dormitories for the sick and for the poor. And in many ways, in doing that, he laid the foundations of Russian Orthodox monasticism, which to this day would still have that tradition of dormitories for the poor. So, from the days of the Norsemen and the Rurik dynasty that shortly established after the Norsemen, it's clear that Christianity by this stage had become well established under Vladimir, with an almost Constantinian founding narrative. It was not, though, to flourish unchallenged. Indeed, the move from Kievan Rus to Muscovy is no gentle evolution. In many ways, it's the result of significant rupture in the form of the ravaging Tartars. It's worth noting, though, that there was already a fragility in the Duchy of Kiev, as it had become known, in the princedom of Vladimir and his successors. Its internal governance was frail, and there was infighting. The Byzantine alliance with the so-called Pechenegs had also weakened Kiev, as Byzantium used the Pechenegs to defend themselves against the Kievans. So Byzantium and Kiev are also getting into conflict. And those twin weaknesses affect Kiev's trade, and that in turn means that the Tartars could inflict more mayhem than perhaps they easily could have done earlier in the time. So, having traced very briefly the rise of Christianity under, first of all, Kirill and Methodius, those very early sown seeds, and then looking at the Ruriks that came out of the Scandinavian invasion, we go through Vladimir to the arrival of the Tartars, which might be described as the making of Muscovy, the absolute development of Moscow as the Third Rome. We trace those alliances and the emergence of Kievan Rus, the beginning of Christian Russia, right back. But the Third Rome appears even earlier than that, as we shall see, and not in connection with Moscow. Noting that the governance of Kievan Rus is weakening, the Tartars, the name given to the mixture of Turkic and Mongol peoples originating in northern and central Asia, were famous for their military supremacy, but they were equally famous for their effective administration and for their ability to build governmental systems. And so their power was consolidated not only through raids and invasions, but by following up by good nation-state management. It was in 1240 that the Tartars sacked Kiev, in what was their furthest west of their invasive forays, and it was led by the followers of Genghis Khan. It became known as the Golden Horde, but is perhaps more properly known as the Kipchuk Khan. Sorry, I can't say that ever. The Kipchuk Khan. The destructive power of their invasion was such that links between Western and Eastern Christendom were shattered in such a way that they have never really been fully re-established, and perhaps laid a sort of cementing gap between Latin Christianity, Byzantium, and Russia, perhaps laid that gap that would always remain for Russia between the West and the East. The Tatars' physical and cultural attack was savage upon Holy Rus. But it's also the case, arguably, that after an initial barbarism, and despite the Kipchak Khan maintaining their own animist belief system, as well as elements of Islam as it grew in strength among their Turkic population, at the same time, there was a sort of tolerance between Christianity, the Christianity of Kievan Rus, and these other invading religions. It was a tolerance, and it was not a conversion. And the Christians were made, through obedience, to pray for their Tatar overlords, as well as to be obedient to them. And then they were left in peace. And Byzantium, seeing the threat of Latin Christendom, preferred to build bridges with the Islamic invaders and to work with that tolerance than necessarily to embrace Latin Christendom itself. I think for us, it's hard to imagine the levels of this mistrust between Latin Christendom and Byzantium. And the thing it reminds me of quite often is when you see different elements within Judaism, between, say, liberal Judaism and Orthodox Judaism, the sort of mistrust that exists between two parts of what you might see as one whole. They clearly didn't. And so they much preferred to build those alliances with the invading force. And so the Metropolitan of Kiev, in the time of that invasion, in the years after the sacking of Kiev, would rotate between a Byzantine Metropolitan and a Rus Metropolitan. So that there was, as it were, a sort of communication that existed. There was clearly some level of cooperation that would exist. In a rather lovely little book by Francis House, which was written in the 90s, shortly after the end of the Cold War, he talks quite a bit about the effect of that Tatar invasion. Because what we mustn't think is, although there was tolerance, the level of destruction that had been wrought following both the decline of Kievan Rus and the invasion of the Tatars was such that people moved out of towns. They scattered to smaller villages and settlements. And the point that Francis House makes now is if you fly over Ukraine or areas that would be in Kievan Rus, you can see still that actually the population is scattered to small settlements. And that goes right back to the Tatar invasion. It really was a huge upheaval culturally for them, despite the fact that Christianity and elements of Kievan culture survived. It was collaboration and cooperation, but it was also obedience. The one place that did seem to survive, though, was the place we talked about earlier, Gorodishia, Novgorod, perhaps because it was very willing to work with its Tatar masters. But in a sense, it almost became a republic in its own right. It managed to preserve itself through obedience to its Tatar masters. And as Novgorod thrived, it became a city of churches, a sort of unique mini republic. And it got the title Tretia Rome, the Third Rome. So that title of the Third Rome was originally put upon Novgorod after the Tatar invasion, as it began to grow as a separate city. So you can see, going right back to those Scandinavian invasions, that Novgorod has been a sort of cultural heart. And because it preserved its role, because it managed to play politically its masters quite well, it becomes, in that sense, the Third Rome. But it didn't really stick. It wasn't a title that would stick. It was a title that would come back later. The place where it would stick, though, was in a small settlement, a small wooden settlement, that you can see a picture of it if I can find it properly. The small wooden settlement of Moscow. That's a slightly larger settlement of Moscow. Moscow was a very small, originally, wooden settlement that then grew into this settlement here. So it was a very strange place to get the fame that it did get. But it was on the confluence of rivers, and that made porterage really easy. And it connected the Oka, Moskva, and Volga rivers. I think there's a book, isn't there, recently out on the Volga River and the importance of the Volga River. But that's where it had its initial power. Secondly, the rulers of Moskva were very clever at cultivating the Kipchak Khan. They prayed for him in the Christian liturgy, and they even minted their loyalty in Arabic on coins. But it was the heroic, almost mythically heroic, Alexander Nevsky's son Daniel, who took Moskva to be his city and the seat of government, and he paid great obeisance. Sorry, I've just lost my place. He paid great obeisance to, bear with me, to the Khan. So the Khan was, as it were, the leader of the Kipchak dynasty, in the same way that Genghis Khan was a Khan. So it was Kipchak Khan who was of this particular area of Kiev and Rus. So he paid great obeisance, and the Khan would then grant him, in return for the coinage, in return for paying obedience, praying in the liturgy, the title of Grand Principality. So Moskva, this little kind of wooden shanty town, having played its cards quite well, becomes a grand principality. And that means they could raise taxes for themselves. It means people saw security and safety there. And just as the populations had exploded away from towns where the Kipchak Khan had been, so when they saw the security developing in Moskva, they begin to come back in. There's a population influx with the obvious rise in power that comes from wealth, security, and taxation. Geographically, it became a focus for both political and church power. Even monasticism began to grow around Moscow, and that was thanks in part to the cult of St. Sergius of Radonezh, who is still regarded probably as the premier saint of Russian Orthodoxy. And soon there was a grand monastery built outside Moscow, and that became the place dedicated to Sergius of Radonezh and his ministry. You can see now the gravity as people move towards Moscow, away from Kiev, which had just lost its power, partly from being ravaged, partly from the fact that it was being played by Byzantium, partly by the fact that simply it had just lost power in the invasion itself. But the uneasy truce between Christian Rus and the Kipchak Khans did not see Moscow rise unchallenged. And as the Mongol power in the Kipchak Khan dynasty began to teeter, the Grand Prince Dmitry of Lithuania Grand Prince Dmitry began to take advantage. He gathered Russians who had now lived for 2 generations under Mongol rule to fight against their overlords. Indeed, one historian, Sergei Solovyov, has described it as Europe's victory over Asia. The subjugation that came about, I completely lost my place. So what happens here is at the same time as Kiev goes down, the Grand Prince of Lithuania sees a chance to seize the power against Moscow together with the Kipchak dynasty. And what's fascinating there is that the Lithuanian prince had no religion at all. He wasn't Christian, he wasn't Muslim, he wasn't animist, he hadn't claimed any particular religion, which meant he could ally with anyone. So he sees Kiev in the west of what was originally Kiev and Rus fading and thinks, I can invade, or I can go into an alliance with the Kipchuks. Obviously, he has no particular axe to grind religiously, and then invade and take the power from the Grand Prince of Moscow. And it's at this point that, again, we begin to see the kind of mythological aspects of Christianity taking root, no longer in Kiev, but in Moscow, in Moskva. And there's a battle, and the battle is in a place called Kulikova. And it is the battle of Grand Prince Dmitry against the Grand Prince of Lithuania and the Maimai Khan, one of the other Khans in the region who had allied with the Grand Prince of Lithuania to take over Moscow. It's an absolutely vast battle. And what we're told, again, in these mythical texts, is that Dmitry goes out to pray with St. Sergius in his monastery. We don't believe this is probably true, but it's all part of the narrative. And that St. Sergius said, you must go out and fight, and you will win. And so the battle happens. Dmitry maneuvers his forces And we're told there are tens of thousands of troops involved, although we have no accurate records of how many were in fact involved. But we do know that the Muscovite forces were probably smaller than the combined forces of Lithuania and the Maimai Khan, and the Genoese had also joined in on this alliance. And it looked like defeat was assured for Moscow. But Moscow won. It was one of those David and Goliath moments. And behind it, of course, you have this prayer from the monastery of St. Sergius. You have this idea that Christianity has conquered through the gift of God, or certainly that's the mythical line that we are told. This all centering around Moscow. So the battle originally, the whole beginning of Holy Rus in Kiev, the gravity moves to Moscow, and then Moscow, as it were, has its own founding narrative of Christianity. And although to all intents and purposes, it really was a noble and notable military victory, that David and Goliath moment, the victory itself, its mythical history that goes around it, of the Grand Prince and the Russian holy man, is perhaps a little bit overextended. It's recorded in one of these other texts called the account of the Battle of Mama. It's not a nationalistic legend as such, but it is a legend that puts Christianity at the heart of Moscow and at the heart of Russia and Russia's claims to be a third Rome. Because at this point, Byzantium is also in decline. The Grand Princedom of Moscow, which is now absolutely independent of the Kipchak Khans, and Christian Russia seem to have survived against all odds. The narrative of that battle holds that 253,000 Russians perished out of 300,000, although historians believe that to be a massively gross exaggeration. It is believed that up to 100,000 troops died. So although it is a founding myth, and even with the exaggerations aside, it's still a colossal loss, there's no doubt about the fact that it was a huge hit for Moscow too. It was not the end of the Khan dynasty. It was just the foundation of that myth, again, being established in that battle. Because there are, for another 2 years later, they're still under the control of the Khan Tokhtamij, and subsequent leaders, and indeed patriarchs who followed, would build upon that Christian victory, but it was not secured fully until years later. The threat of the Tatars was reducing, mainly because their own power had waned. They had burned themselves out. At this stage, the threat from the Grand Prince of Lithuania had also diminished. Moscow was, without question, becoming the home of the political fortunes of Holy Rus. It was the spiritual center for Christianity now that Kiev had faded, and by virtue of being the unquestioned home now of the Patriarch and Metropolitan of Holy Rus, it was becoming established as a political force as well. In many ways, the following centuries saw the settling and establishing of Orthodoxy and Moscow as one and the same. The growing spread of Orthodox monasticism was both a catalyst and a symbol of this stabilizing Christian formation. As the culture settled and grew, so did its cultural forms, its art, and its iconography. So in the period around 1360 to 1430, we know that Andrei Rublev painted the icon of the Holy Trinity, which you'll have seen countless times. Again, it's one of the foundation elements of that idea of the Third Rome, was that the culture had settled sufficiently that art and architecture and culture had begun to develop in and of itself unique to Russia. Moscow had, through spiritual and political warfare, become the de facto center of Russian spiritual and political life. And while its own fortunes had changed for the better, the worsening fortunes of Byzantium could only strengthen the cultural power of Moscow. The fall of the home of Orthodox Christianity to the Islamic invaders was a catastrophe in most ways, but for Moscow, with its geography set well east and its politics beginning to stabilize, it left a strategically helpful hole for Moscow to occupy. And with stability comes power, and the Grand Prince of Moscow soon annexed the independent Republic of Novgorod, which had still been thriving in its own peculiar way, as he worked to fortify his imperial power. Likewise, the same Grand Prince, Prince Ivan III, married a niece of the Byzantine emperor. And so it was around this time that the title Caesar or Tsar fell into occasional use. Fears for the upcoming end of the world, the apocalyptic period for them, only fired up that imperial enthusiasm. Calendrical calculations and the fall of Byzantium had led to the very real fear that the apocalypse was due. And as we see in elements of Western medieval culture, that only seems to develop art and architecture. There was, Dermot McCulloch writes in his huge book, a festival of church building. It was a time of extraordinary fertility for the Russian church, for its culture and its flourishing. It was this zest for meeting the end times with enthusiasm, vigor, and culture and beauty that led to the church adopting the term not heard for some years since the rise of Novgorod. Church leaders, not so much the political leaders, wanted the church to be kept in its place, given fervour and fear in good times and bad. And so the term the Third Rome was once again occasionally heard. The most famous example being the monk Philophe, who wrote to the Grand Prince Vasily III that Rome had fallen through heresy, the Apollonian heresy, and Byzantium had fallen to the Turks. Philophe writes this: "In the new Third Rome, your mighty Tsavo, to shine like the sun throughout the whole universe, is to endure as long as the world endures. You are the only Tsar for Christians in the whole world. 2 Romes have fallen, and the third stands. A fourth will not be." And so it is that Russia, focused in Moscow as the seat of its power, claims its place not only as a power within Holy Rus, but within Christendom. It is, like so much history of the developing medieval Christian world, a tale of murky politics, violence, luck, and power. What is clear, though, in this story of the emergence of Orthodoxy in Holy Rus and the emergence of Moscow is the inextricability of church and nation. 2 things stand out for me in that incredible story of a faith in a nation. Firstly, that for us in this nation, in Britain or in England, which despite the establishment of the Christian faith within the law, remains a place where there is a separation of powers, it can seem hard to picture a world in which faith and political fortunes are so closely entwined. The story is one and the same, but it was for us centuries before. In many ways, in Russia, though, it remains still today. Secondly, it's the sheer power of mythology and the legend that underwrites that sense of ecclesial and political understanding of the Russian peoples. It is, as we have seen and will see, a mythology that, for good and for ill, still dominates the life of contemporary Russia. Some of what we shall see and read in our papers of the horror of Ukraine and Russia has its roots deep set in the story of that founding narrative of a nation or of nations, united as they are by their roots set deep in Holy Rus. Next week, I want to explore a little bit of the myth and how it influences contemporary thought in 19th century Russia and 20th century Russia, how that Western and Eastern pull continues. And as I said at the beginning, when we come round to the final lecture, we'll see how in Vladimir Putin's vision of the world, in many ways a warped and barbaric vision, he comes right back to the founding mythology of Holy Rus that began in Kiev, that began way back with the invasion from Scandinavia and continues today as a myth of Moscow as the Third Rome.
Right.
So I'm going to stop there, and I'm open to questions or thoughts or reflections. Take this down. So please feel free to unmute and ask if you want to. Trevor. Can you unmute Trevor? There.
I've muted perhaps, muted Ashley.
Ah,
Yes, you've done it. That's it.
right. As I'm looking
I
at the
can't hear you
screen,
there. Hello. Yep. It's good.
good, right. We'll start again now, Gregory.
I can hear you.
To the left of your screen, as I'm looking at it,
Yeah.
there was a series of slides, and I think you've only shown one of them.
Yep. They're just pictures to accompany. Let me go through them.
Pretty disorganized, isn't he? Keeps losing his place in the script. It's poor teaching.
Sorry, Jean, I can hear that. Sorry, it's quite hard to operate the whole thing myself, and I'm trying to do so. Yeah. Share screen.
Yeah, it's quite good for right now. That's us.
There.
You're on.
So, it was hard for me to see my script at the same time, so I do apologize. I tried to do the picture at the same time. This was Kirill and Methodius in a Russian icon, early Russian icon from the same period as Rublev. And then the map that came, this shows the map of the Varangians that came down to Holy Kiev.
Very useful, right? Okay.
And then this is the map of the Mongol invasion of Kiev and Rus.
Right.
So it shows, just shows you going up to Kiev here. And that's as far west as they came. So I'm sorry I couldn't do it at the same time. And the final one was simply a picture of the ground. That's Moscow as it developed after it became Third Rome.
Excellent. Thank you.
No, I'm sorry if it was disorganized, Jean. I was trying to do two things at once.
Can I ask a question?
Please do, yeah.
David Doherty, sorry. The sense I have taken from your talk that to some extent there was a move of political power from, say, Byzantium towards Moscow. Was there a sense that there was also a transfer of theological energy or innovation or thinking, or did that tend to be more distributed around the Orthodox world?
So that's a really good question, and it will come out hopefully in the later talks. No, there wasn't, I don't think. I think the concentration in Russia was very much on a sort of conservative view of theology emerging from the liturgy itself, and therefore exploring prayer and theology in terms of practice much more than developing it in terms of an academic or a rigorous intellectual approach. So no, I don't think it was, but I do think, and I hope it came through in the talk, that it was definitely a political move, and the two things were immensely closely tied together, and that obviously Christianity was what the religion that was adapted and then continued, but I think the rise of Moscow was much about trade routes and the power of and income that comes from Byzantium.
And the center of ecclesiastical authority just moved with the center of political authority.
Absolutely, it's two and one, and then obviously with the idea of the Tsar at the same time. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I mean, you've been speaking a great deal about myths, and one of the myths that I've often held is that theologically Orthodoxy was fairly monolithic and consistent across the various churches. To what extent is that true, or was there theological variety across the family of Orthodox churches?
That's a really good question. I don't think I'd be well enough versed at that particular period in terms of the earliest church to differ between the two of them, but there was clearly a sense in which even with Kiev establishing itself and Vladimir developing buildings and churches, that it was definitely not seen as civilized in the same term as Byzantium was. And I think what's really interesting, as Orthodoxy has developed over centuries, is they are extremely different, and the whole autocephalous way in which Orthodoxy continues to evolve is that they're very, very distinct. And I think even at that very early stage, what Kiev did, it tried to outdo Russia. I could try to outdo Byzantium in the very early stages. So its churches were almost like sort of, the ultimate bling in terms of what you might want to produce to compete with Hagia Sophia, where you have the original beauty and honor. So I think there was that sense of it being very much nouveau and not cultured. But then over the centuries afterwards, I think the absolute distinctive feature of Orthodoxy is each church is it has similar styles and approaches, but is entirely different in terms of the way in which they often manage themselves and the way in which they manage jurisdiction, particularly.
Thank you.
I think next week I might actually just abandon the PowerPoint, because I think that made things more complicated than it needed to be. But thank you very much for bearing with us, and sorry this hasn't been as well organized as it could have been, but I appreciate you being here tonight. So any other questions, do please ask. Otherwise, I'll bid you good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.